Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins and Sabina Higgins.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Crouch. I'm the Acting Vice Chancellor. And on behalf of our Vice Chancellor, Professor Adam Habib, and the Wits community, I would say also the South African community, certainly in Johannesburg and the Greater Gauteng, I would like to formally welcome His Excellency, or Her Excellency, Higgins, the President and his wife from Ireland, to our humble university. Humble in the sense that we don't get visits from presidents every day, so we're indeed grateful, and I did articulate that to Mr. Higgins. We're indeed grateful that he could find himself, his wife, and the delegation could find time to come and speak to us here at Wits University. I'm also indeed honored by the fact that we could be joined to welcome the President and his delegation today by so many members of the Wits community, and certainly alumni and stalwarts of many struggles of South Africa. So again, I'm going to try and keep it short. I'm going to ask Professor Jaishan to do a further welcome, but I believe that apart from the President and his wife, we also have the Ambassador and other members of the Irish delegation here. So welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Acting Vice Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Andrew Crouch, Your Excellencies and representatives from the various embassies of Austria, Croatia, Spain, and Ireland. There are a number of other people from linked to the embassies themselves who are present, so welcome to you too. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome the President of Ireland, and a friend of mine, I can add, to address us on international human rights law at the Wits School of Law. But before I proceed to introduce myself, there are two people here today that I would also like to acknowledge as part of the stalwarts of our liberation, Advocate Cuny and Advocate Bezos. Two people who led the defense of Nelson Mandela on more than one occasion. So welcome to both of you to the School of Law, and welcome to you for, in many other ways, as a return to the School of Law. I am Vinod Jayachan. I'm the head of the School of Law here at Wits, and prior to arriving here, I had spent some 9 years in Ireland at the Irish Centre for Human Rights as a Deputy Director at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And over that period of time, I got to know one of the most prominent citizens of Ireland, both as a friend and colleague. I can recall that on some of the late Friday afternoon trains from Dublin to Galway, with a happy sense meeting, 3 hours would sort of just disappear completely once I had met my friend Michael D. Higgins. So I'm very privileged and very honored to be able to introduce you to someone who I know quite well. And I think after his address to you today, you might know even better. So Michael D. Higgins was inaugurated as the 9th President of Ireland on the 11th of November 2011. a passionate political voice, a poet and writer, academic and statesman, human rights advocate, promoter of inclusive citizenship, and champion of creativity within Irish society. Michael D. Higgins has previously served at almost every level of public life in Ireland, including as Ireland's first Minister of Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht. Michael D. Higgins was born on the 18th of April 1941 in Limerick City and was raised in County Clare. He was a factory worker and a clerk before becoming the first in his family to access higher education. He studied at the University College Galway, at the University of Manchester, and later at Indiana University. Michael D. Higgins is married to Sabina Higgins, who has joined us on this particular occasion, and they have 4 children. And Sabina Higgins herself is a founding member of the Focus Theatre and the Stanislavski Studio in Dublin. But as a lecturer in political science and sociology at the National University of Ireland in Galway and in the United States, Michael D. Higgins was a passionate proponent for the establishment of access to third-level education beyond the walls of established universities. He was centrally involved in the development of extramural studies at the National University of Ireland in Galway, and he travelled extensively across the west of Ireland to provide accessible evening classes for interested students. A desire to work more directly for equality and justice led Michael D. Higgins to enter public life, and he went on to serve as a public representative at many levels, from councillor and mayor to 9 years in the Shannon and 25 years in the Dáil Éireann. As Ireland's first Minister of Arts in 1993 to 1997, Michael D. Higgins' achievements included the reinvigoration of the Irish film industry, the establishment of Telefis na Gaeilge, now TG4, the repeal of censorship under Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act. He also established a rich network of local arts and cultural venues which brought a crucial access to citizens across Ireland to these facilities. Moreover, he drove the revitalization of Ireland's canal networks, resulting in over 1,000 kilometers of navigable waterways, supporting thousands of jobs and creating wealth in many rural and economically deprived areas of the state. Michael D. Higgins has, like many in Ireland, seen generations of his family emigrate. He has a strong interest and solidarity with the Irish abroad and has been a regular visitor to Irish centres around the world. Throughout his life, Michael D. Higgins has campaigned for human rights and for the promotion of peace and democracy in Ireland and in many other parts of the world, from Nicaragua, Chile, to Cambodia, to Iraq, and Somalia. In 1992, Michael D. Higgins was the first recipient of the Sean McBride Peace Prize from the International Peace Bureau in Helsinki, in recognition of his work for peace and justice in many parts of the world. He also was a very active member of the anti-apartheid movement with the late Kader Asmal, and we exchanged many views about how things went right and probably not so right with the anti-apartheid movement in engagements that we might have had socially over that period of time. But apart from all these other achievements, Michael D. Higgins is also a writer and a poet, contributing to many books covering diverse aspects of Irish politics, sociology, history, and culture. He has published 2 collections of essays, one of which is called Causes for Concern, Irish Politics, Culture and Society, and the second is called Renewing the Republic. He has also published 4 collections of poetry: The Betrayal, The Season of Fire, An Arid Season, and New and Selected Poems. So in summary, Michael D. Higgins' life has seen him spending 25 years in the Dáil Éireann, 9 years in the Shannon Éireann, as Ireland's first cabinet minister for arts, culture and Gaeltacht from 1993 to 97. And is the minister responsible directly for the promotion of the Irish language and for the economic and social development of Irish-speaking areas in the state. He has been the Labour Party spokesperson for foreign affairs in the Irish Parliament and a founder member of the Joint Electors Committee on Foreign Affairs. He's been the Lord Mayor on 2 occasions of Galway. He's the Honorary Adjunct Professor at the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And apart from all these other things that he does, he's been for 10 years, from 1982 to 1992, a regular columnist in the popular Hot Press magazine, in which he engaged the young audience on the issues of the day. Some of his honorary fellowships and memberships include a Doctorate of Laws from the National University of Ireland in Galway. He's a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he's been conferred with the City of the Freedom of the City of Galway, as he has received the Freedom of Clonmel, County Tipperary. He's decreed a Distinguished Guest of Santiago, Chile. And in 2013, he received the Medal of the Sorbonne in Paris. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great pleasure to ask my friend and colleague, Michael D. Higgins, His Excellency, President of Ireland, to address you.
Gwynnig cor a gedal sias mo fwycas a sactor firgin fólse a darish of Rome Heimström a van Kela is yet a toy tashed love. I'm very deeply honored to have been invited to address you today at the School of Law of the University of Witwatersrand. And I want to say as well that in your warm welcome, I am privileged by that welcoming group included George Bezos and Stephen Cooney, who have made such a distinguished contribution to law and jurisprudence. May I express my sincere thanks to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Crouch, for his welcome and for the invitation to speak today, and also my friend Professor Jacqueline for his kind introduction, and indeed the Deputy Head of School, Professor Mann. I express my particular thanks to Ms. Asma Ouni for her work in ensuring that today's event could happen, and of course to all of you in a very busy time, when that most exhilarating time in an academic's life, correcting exams, is well underway. It was the only unsatisfactory part of my own life as an academic, I have to tell you. As the international community embarks on the process of developing what will be the successor standards to the Millennium Development Goals, and as South Africa celebrates 20 years of democracy, I believe that this is an appropriate moment to reflect on what has been achieved in both development and in advancing the protection of human rights in this region. And in addressing you today in this Centre of Intellectual Excellence, my wish is to bring a message of optimism and hope for what I believe is a crucial moment in the evolution of these disciplines in the social, political, economic and legal areas. Democracy and human rights are spreading and strengthening across many parts of Africa, with measurable progress in the protection of rights for many groups. There has been progress too with regard to tackling poverty in the region, and at global level, progress under the Millennium Development Goals has been impressive. Yes, levels of absolute poverty have reduced significantly and continue to fall. Child hunger and child mortality are greatly reduced. The Millennium Development Goals on tackling malaria and tuberculosis are on course to be met, which will have the consequence of saving millions of lives. Access to clean drinking water is improving, as is access to education, especially for girls. Yet, at the same time, prevailing levels of exclusion and marginalization cannot be seen as constituting anything other than a reality of profound and persistent global injustice. There are many immediate challenges before us, challenges that we must share: climate change, population growth, hunger, disease, conflict, and unemployment. Each of these great issues call to be addressed directly in the Sustainable Development Goals process, but I believe that our efforts to address these problems are all linked to a central question as to how we link our aspiration for human rights with the demand for development and economic growth. And as we embark now on this process, post-2015, the process will have begun all through the first 6 months of next year, there is, I believe, a generational opportunity to address this central question head-on, and in doing so to confront the weaknesses and limitations in our human rights discourse and in our development discourse. I believe that we have at this moment an opportunity to reconcile outstanding tensions between human rights and development. And I try to remain optimistic that through correct strategic and tactical choices, we can reasonably hope for a more robust and effective delivery of human rights protections in the decades ahead. As President of Ireland, I can say with the benefit of recent history that the challenges facing the different regions of the world in this respect are increasingly converging in nature. How to connect development and economic concerns with ethical questions of human rights is also a primary challenge to my nation as we emerge from a period of recent great economic instability and uncertainty. Our national experiences have much to offer each other as we strive to resolve the tensions between development and human rights. In addressing this theme of human rights and development, my first focus is on the role of the international systems and institutions, and on how the relationship between development and human rights within the United Nations mechanisms needs to be reevaluated. At this level, the relationship between development and human rights and the necessary discourse remains problematic. This is first and foremost, of course, an intellectual question, but it is also one with real political and practical impact. Secondly, and following on from the task of reconstructing the discourse at the United Nations level, we must review, I believe, our understanding of the relative and appropriate roles of state authorities, international bodies, and private actors in delivering human rights. I believe that a deeper understanding of how individual states have the capacity to influence each other can support greater progress in the years ahead. In the South African context, the richness and strength of your Constitution and Bill of Rights is a key factor in positioning this state as a leader in expanding the protection of rights across your region. Thirdly, I believe we must put social movements back at the heart of our understanding of human rights. We must recapture a sense of the public space which embraces the importance of activism in constructing human rights, and one which also recognizes the centrality of education as a crucial element in fostering a healthy national human rights culture. Despite progress, most notably in the reduction in aggregate poverty rates, it is clear that the existing global development framework does not sufficiently promote, protect, and integrate the universal and indivisible nature of human rights. Moreover, at times development initiatives have directly contributed to violations of human rights. One such example can be seen in the forced eviction of large numbers of people from their land, with whom they had an intergenerational connection, in order to make way for major infrastructure projects. The World Commission on Dams estimates that between 40 and 80 million people have been displaced to facilitate the construction of dams alone. We've seen that a disproportionate number of those forcibly displaced are indigenous people and poor communities, for whom the experience of being displaced can be particularly damaging and traumatic, further embedding them in the destructive cycle of poverty. And I've seen this in so many places. More recently, just before I became president, in Colombia. We have also seen, under the banner of development, dramatically changed patterns of landholding and acquisition, with the diversion of land use from small-scale and community-based food production to agricultural and biofuel production on an industrial scale. According to Professor Ruth Hall from the University of Cape Town, some 56 to 227 million hectares have changed hands globally over the last 5 to 10 years, with African land making up to 60 to 70% of these large land deals. The so-called violence of economic development has also manifested itself in a less direct but equally destructive way through environmental degradation. In addition to the entirely unsustainable levels of CO2 emissions, we continue to see rampant increases in deforestation, shrinking fish stocks, and threats to biodiversity, often in the name of economic growth, and unquestioned economic growth. Faced with depleted productive resources, vulnerable individuals and communities, again a disproportionate number of whom are indigenous and otherwise marginalised, stand on the front line of price shocks and extreme weather events, which are having a direct impact on their livelihoods, health and well-being. Too narrow a conception of development, focusing primarily on economic growth, can often subject significant numbers of people to the violence of development, whereby the well-being of the most vulnerable is devastated by the development process itself. At the same time, the argument that economic and human development must act as a prerequisite for the realization of human rights is still a prevalent view. The maxim of food first, freedom later has been cited often disingenuously by those who would seek to postpone political reform in the name of economic development. However, this view that human rights can be suspended in the name of macroeconomic stability would also have the effect of preventing individuals from being empowered to realize their rights in such a way that they lead and take full ownership of the development process. Without this, we have no means of accurately and legitimately conceptualizing which development needs are the most pressing. We need, I believe, to take great care to avoid the projection of a false choice between the pursuit of human rights and global development. Experience has clearly shown us that such arguments are inherently and demonstrably flawed. Respecting economic and social rights, for example, by ensuring access to quality education, to healthcare, to housing, to decent work, can prove to be an invaluable instrument in human capital with enormous development dividends. The achievement of such rights can achieve a platform from which a pluralist set of economic models that combine development, ethics, and cultural legacy can be combined. Apart then from the potential for conceptions of development to run counter to human rights, there's also the widespread view in the developing world that development models are externally imposed. Development has come to be seen as synonymous with the imposition of what is perceived as Western growth-centered economic models, drawn, I must say, from a very narrow field of assumptions, and assumptions that are not submitted to a theoretical test. I think, too, writers, for example, such as Balakrishnan and Rajagopal, have argued convincingly that our dominant models of development can be traced back through modernization theory to colonialism. He argues that the role of the international development and financial institutions can be understood in this way too, as instruments of domination. At the same time, I think we must reject any fatalism about the historic content of models of development and look to reconstitute theories of development and human rights for the future. I began to study in the United States, I remember, when the Princeton studies between 1962 and 1966 were the texts which were literally imposed on those of us who were interested in social change. But I believe that it is possible to forge new models of development that respect dignity, culture, and traditions. And we're beginning to see the seeds of such models in the work of Amartya Sen and others, where a broader and more ethical form of development is being presented, one which is embedded in rights discourse. This will be a central task of the ongoing intergovernmental discussions to agree a new set of global development goals, the post-2015 development agenda, which will succeed the Millennium Development Goals when they expire next year. The recent appointment of Ireland's permanent representative at the United Nations, together with Kenya's representatives, as co-facilitators for this process, is of course a great honour for our country, but it is a challenge to us, which I know our diplomacy is determined to meet. And there is too an opportunity we will have to draw on the reconceptualizations of the field of theory and practice. In this process, it will be essential that African states have a leading voice. We have seen with the initial rise of the Third World in the 1960s that states working together can radicalize and alter dominant discourses, at least for a period. In this regard, we must also recognize that the traditional dichotomy between North and South is breaking down. For example, one of the changes we see in recent years is that institutions and instruments that have traditionally been applied to developing countries, so-called, are now being applied to developed states also, including the involvement of the International Monetary Fund in European states and in Ireland. The missing sense of deliberative democracy is a global phenomenon. The rise of new centres of economic power in this hemisphere alters power dynamics at the global level too. Growth in Africa, Latin America and Asia holds the promise of narrowing wealth gaps between regions, and the increasingly complex nature of new global alliances can present creative opportunities in addressing common global problems. In this process, the voice of Africa can be stronger than ever before, and the message that Africa can articulate about the need to redefine development in a way that respects rights and culture has never been more necessary, but it is also full of promise. In looking then to the future evolution of rights and development discourse, a second area for consideration is the relative roles of international and national institutions in promoting the protection of human rights. And in reimagining the nexus between human rights and development, there is a need to move beyond an uncritical acceptance of the primacy of international legal institutions and instruments. It is vitally important that international lawyers face the significant challenge of fundamentally reconsidering how they conceive of their discipline, through reflecting on what role international law has in bringing about meaningful and lasting global change in the lives of real people and communities. And when looking at outcomes, there can be no denying the achievements of advancing civil and political rights in many African states in recent decades. In many countries, full deliberative democracy is still a work in progress, but the momentum away, for example, from one-party state systems to free elections is unmistakable and is, I fervently hope, irresistible. But what has been the relative role of the international human rights and development infrastructure in contributing to this achievement, one might ask? Certainly, civil and political rights objectives have been increasingly linked to aid and development measures. Rajagopala, for example, however, argues in his text, Human Rights from Below, he argues that overestimating the role of international agents in the development of human rights at the national level has supported an expansion of the reach and role of those international institutions in the object states, rather than any sustained improvement in democratic participation by grassroots. In their recent study, Socializing States, Promoting Human Rights Through International Law, Ryan Goodman and Derek Jinks posit three mechanisms by which state-level protection of human rights can be influenced through inducements being imposed from outside, through persuading states of the validity of human rights, and through what they define as acculturation, or processes of socialization of states. Goodman and James argue that acculturation plays an underestimated role in progressive change at the national level, whereby peer influences between states, especially within regional social networks, can act as powerful forces in inspiring progressive change in law and practice. They present a persuasive body of evidence to argue that the widespread and contemporaneous advances in the protection of women's rights, for example, and children's rights in the recent years can be explained in this way. Regional leadership, by example, is an underestimated and highly important force for the protection of human rights. And in this respect, the role of South Africa, and specifically the Constitution of the Republic, should be considered, I believe, not only in its foundational role at the national level, but also in its potential as a model for others. As South Africa has demonstrated so remarkably, it is at the level of the national constitution that we see the optimum locus for the resolution of questions of values, sovereignty, and rights. And over the last 20 years, your constitution has acted as a beacon for human rights protection, not only in this region, but around the world. It is a document, I believe, that invites citizens everywhere to the necessary tasks of transformation. In Ireland, for example, the South African constitutional scheme was a key influencing factor in the consideration by our Constitutional Convention of the question of constitutional protection of economic and social rights. Thus, by appreciating the actual and potential role of national exemplars of human rights protection in influencing peer states, we can help refocus on the importance of internal mechanisms over extraneous institutional expansion. In seeking the most effective mechanisms for transmitting rights protection, we must also look beyond the state. It is now time to admit that human rights law has traditionally suffered from an overly state-centric perspective, which has been focused almost exclusively on governments and international institutions, with the principle of national sovereignty at its core. Again, in this respect, we have much to learn from Africa in terms of bottom-up and innovative practices, approaches to political participation in the construction of rights. These include the post-conflict constitutional arrangements which were adopted in Rwanda, the experiments in transitional restorative justice taking place in South Africa and northern Uganda, and new mechanisms for developing the social contract between the citizen and the state. These new approaches to citizen participation and representation warrant closer examination by those who are charged with improving the nature of engagement between the state and its citizens. However, the roles of societal actors and social movements have generally been marginalized in the broader narrative on international human rights. Conspicuously missing has been an appreciation of the importance and potential of an array of groups which have mobilized as social movements and civil society actors, be they women's groups, sexual or ethnic minorities, indigenous and displaced people, or the rural poor. The anti-apartheid movement is a crucial example of how social movements can and have sparked, advocated for, and effected seismic changes nationally and globally. The movement changed the face of social democracy and participation, transforming forever a country's democratic being through the struggle of a people oppressed. Through it, built a conscience and a following across the world, driven by the people of South Africa. It garnered strong and committed support in Ireland, but it also, by focusing on the extreme consequences of exclusion, inspired us in our work at home to build a more just and equal society. Not only did the anti-apartheid movement drive civil and political change in South Africa, it also demonstrated how the architecture of international law can be shaped by grassroots resistance. on the premise that the anti-apartheid movement was not only about civil liberties, but about the conditions necessary to enjoy these freedoms in human dignity. The freedom to flourish that goes beyond the simply allowance to exist. I think in doing so, it reaffirmed that civil and political rights alone are not sufficient for the realization of socio-economic rights, and that democratic processes alone and of themselves do not necessarily lead to development. Equally, however, we know that the presence of de jure socio-economic rights is not easily translated into de facto socio-economic empowerment. It requires more than formal rights and institutions to ensure human well-being, and in particular to ensure protection of the rights of the most vulnerable. As observed by the former United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, poverty undermines basic human rights, such as access to food, to shelter, and to education. It entrenches discrimination and marginalization, and makes it difficult for victims to obtain justice and remedies when their rights are violated. It is in this context that we've seen the transformation impact of social movements that employ human rights principles of participation and accountability to defend the interests of the most marginalized. Having given form to human rights instruments in South Africa, we have seen post-apartheid social movements seize upon these, capitalizing on the institution, for example, of the Constitutional Court, to exercise their civil and political rights in order that social and economic rights might benefit the most marginalized. The South African experience, then, presents us with a number of examples of the transformative impact of social movements in leveraging community-based action and existing legal structures that might effect lasting change. And such examples offer us a way forward in ensuring that international human rights has a greater impact and successfully contributes to sustainable development. The ruling of the Constitutional Court in favour of the provision of access to adequate housing in the group boom case of 2000 was a significant achievement for the participation of civil society in articulating and giving voice to the needs of the most marginalized. It was also an important assertion of the justiciability of socio-economic rights, and thus reinforced the accountability of the state to take positive action to address these rights. South Africa's Treatment Action Campaign, which successfully fought for access to antiretroviral treatment as a socio-economic right, also further extended the realm of accountability to citizens. It not only held the state to account, but also multinational pharmaceutical corporations, accusing them of profiteering by keeping the price of drugs high, and arguing this conflicted with the right to life itself. The campaign reaffirmed that public service delivery, a critical issue during the anti-apartheid struggle, continues to be at the heart of the realization of socio-economic rights. The South African experience, these and other social movements, have provided international law and development discourse with evidence of the real capacity of law and justice, and the realization of sustainable outcomes when owned and driven from below. The budgetary implications of protecting, promoting, and fulfilling rights are a common preoccupation of the state, made all the more difficult with strained resources, of course, and competing interests. Whose rights are prioritized and resourced? These are value judgments beyond the realm of a courtroom. It is the norms and values that human rights instruments uphold, however, that provide the foundation for the participation and engagement of civil society to play a meaningful role in the prioritization of rights in democratic and national development processes. I can say that these campaigns have proved inspirational to the Irish people too, just as the anti-apartheid movement did in previous decades. The techniques and strategies developed by the activists and lawyers in the Group Boom and Treatment Action Campaign cases are being used today by communities struggling for housing rights and other economic and social rights in both parts of the island of Ireland. Through empowerment, then, and the use of the human rights principles of participation and accountability. Social movements can uphold human rights and contribute to better development outcomes. We must, therefore, adopt a more eclectic conception of the range of actors capable of agency in bringing about lasting changes in both international human rights and global development. In truth, and this is the most difficult part, this requires nothing less than a paradigm shift in the way in which we conceive of human rights and development. Most importantly, we can no longer conceive of states as being the sole locus around which all human rights issues revolve, and we must instead better appreciate the role and potential role for civil society and social movements. And this reminds us too that we cannot overlook the centrality of cultural rights in any discussion of human rights and sustainable development. Cultural rights empower local communities to take ownership of their own development pathways. The cultural sphere, properly respected, can be a source of vision, offering innovation and imagination in defining what constitutes well-being and a quality of life. As Amartya Sen argued, development is not the acquisition of more goods and services, but the enhanced freedom to choose capabilities to lead the kind of life one values. And in this regard, of course, education is a key component in empowering meaningful participation in society. You are again fortunate to have a rich heritage of understanding, seeing education as central to the process of nation building. How well it was summarized by Gandhi when he said effective education and social justice goals are inextricably linked. A number of years ago, I received as gift from my good friend Kader Asmal a copy of his Spirit of the Nation, an excellent series of essays on the ethos of South African education, which he edited with Wilmot James. It included essays by Kader, of course, and by Cater Regan and Edward Said. This collection, published in 2002, conveyed for me the rich and vibrant national conversation in South Africa about the importance of an education system in empowering advances and development, but one that is not instrumental only. For we often think of civil society as people with placards, Occupy movements, and peaceful protests, and sometimes not so peaceful protests. I have long memories of all of this myself. But however, we must remember that these collectives of solidarity are not the only exercise of power from below. There are also the voices of individuals being asserted quietly, nobly, and just as importantly. The priority which has been afforded by literacy and access to education in the new South Africa cannot be overstated in its importance for the health of your democracy. If we are to reclaim the discourse of human rights as one in which all of our citizens have an active stake, we must empower them with the tools of a rich education. The divided will be a society where the dividend will be a society where rights are living instruments of human fulfillment and progress. A society where the value espoused in your constitution, I quote, to improve the quality of life of all citizens and free the potential of each person. To turn that into a reality and not merely an aspiration is the challenge. I believe that South Africa can play a central role in the evolution of a new approach to human rights and development through its constructive role at the international level, through its leadership role in Africa, informed by the ethical origins of the state and its model constitution, and energized by your history of activism and the vibrant participation of your people. Writing in defense of human rights, my dear friend, the late poet Shemisini, in his poem Republic of Conscience, reminds us that everyone has a role to play in the promotion of human rights. So let me conclude what I have to say, and indeed my visit to this great continent of Africa, with Heaney's voice and his vision of what might be possible if the dream of human rights is to be fulfilled. From the Republic of Conscience. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt and tears which the sky god wept after he dreamt his solitude was endless. I came back from that frugal republic with my 2 arms the one linked, the customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition, that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me when I got home to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. Garbina Mark, thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I told you so, is all I can say. Here we have a keynote address that traverses all through international human rights law, linked not only just from the international bodies themselves and the effect of Millennium Development Goals, but it's truly a kind of speech that links the global with the local and leaves us as South Africans with a fair bit of the work to do that the President has so cajoled us to think about. There were layers of information that I cannot actually do justice to by translating. So thank you very much, Mr. President. Kindly, this President has offered to answer questions. And in the context of South Africa, we understand sometimes. That's not always available. So I would ask you to raise your hands. We'll take 2 questions at a time, and that will allow the President to get his thoughts together, and then we can move to the next few sessions. Please introduce who you are and be brief with your question.
Mr. President, my name is Constantine.
There's a microphone near you.
Thank you. Mr. President, my name is Constantine Tefilopoulos from the School of Law. My question is a brief one. In respect to illegal immigration into Ireland, does Ireland have a defined policy for accepting illegal immigrants from Africa and from the Middle East, particularly Syria? And if you do accept these illegal immigrants, what is their status? And are they entitled eventually to an Irish citizenship? Thank you.
Your Excellency, my intervention is not a question but a word of praise.
Please identify yourself.
Sorry, my name is Jose Nascimento. I'm a South African attorney. I was the leader of the solidarity movement of East Timor in South Africa many years ago, and I'd like to thank you for the role that not only the Irish government played, but the Irish civil society in liberating and promoting that cause. In fact, the solidarity movement headed by Tom Highland was an exemplary one and was at the forefront of all social movements in Europe for the liberation of East Timor. As far as the Irish government goes, I recall meeting up with David Andrews, Foreign Minister of Ireland, in Delhi for the United Nations referendum, and I recall that he spent over a week following and assisting with the United Nations referendum. So for that, I'd like to thank you.
I think I'll start with the second question, indeed, about East Timor. I think there's a great example in that campaign. Tom Highland was a bus conductor, and he gathered information about the conditions in East Timor, and he set up that organization himself. I think I was patron of it at that time, and it just shows you, if you like, how having information about oppression and having information about the consequences of domination and oppression is something that should be open to every citizen, because the campaign that he put together at that time started in Dublin, then extended to different parts of Ireland and through the student movements, and then it went international, and it had a very, very positive outcome. On the first question, I think there is an issue that arises, I think, as well, as to what we mean by illegal. There is no doubt whatsoever that, let me put it like this, I believe that we are currently reviewing the situation of immigrants who have come into Ireland, who might be regarded as illegal. In my constitutional role, I don't speak about specific legislation before the House of Parliament now, but I do speak about the principle. And I find what we're doing through a system, for example, of direct provision, which often leaves people who have come into Ireland from outside the European Union. And last year's big increase were in fact Syrian refugees. But the system of direct provision by which they are put into places that are of accommodation, and where they may be for anything up to 8 to 10 years, is totally unsatisfactory, almost every aspect of it. But I want to just put it like this to you as well. My own work as an academic had migrants and migration at its centre. And in a way, in the Irish case, why do I criticise this mechanism of direct provision? It is simply that I believe it doesn't answer the rights of such people. There are different sources of our population that are coming in. It's now quite an infinitesimal number, I believe, by comparison with where I was in recent times. When I look at the population that has poured into Gambella, for example, in Ethiopia, where there is a threat of violence is assumed, and another 100,000 that will pour on top of 300,000 in areas that can hardly handle it. Or when I look, for example, at the arrangements that are made for refugees on the Turkish border or whatever, I can see that the problem that Ireland describes as a problem sometimes is infinitesimal by comparison with these movements that are going on. And to answer your question very directly, I believe that we do desperately need a revision both of the process and of the law. But then you must ask yourself again, what is happening now at the level of the European Union? It is more than just an Irish case. What is meant by the free movement of labour? If we take the founding treaties of the European Union and you look at the position about the freedom of movement in them, to what extent then is any government free to contradict what is the commitment of the Act itself? So it is a problem. The other, I think, well, I should say, while I'm on this subject of migrants, what we're seeing in Europe generally, roughly speaking, the youth unemployment rate is twice the general rate. So you get, for example, in Greece, it's about 56%. In our own case, in relation with a rate of just over 11% now, down from 15%, the youth unemployment rate is 22%. But right across the cities of Europe, you have a growing amount of young unemployed people, not randomly dispersed in cities, but very often in ghettos. And they are there to be preyed upon by people touting different forms of fundamentalism. And it is true, therefore, you are beginning to see again the rise of thinly veiled and sometimes not veiled at all racism. And this is a very, very, very serious issue. But one of the things that I think where I make my own advocacy is that I don't accept the economic model anyway that suggests that a person is just a commodified unit of labour. I can't see how you could ever make that fit with the discourse within human rights. And similarly, in relation to the development discourse, I think that defining what we meant by development, when I went to the Indiana University, I remember at the end of the 1960s, and the Princeton studies, Lucian Pye, Gabriel Armand, and all of those, they encouraged those of us who were coming to come and study how backward our own people were. With the assumption, a kind of a neo-evolutionary one, that we were making our way from backwardness to modernity. And what was modernity? Modernity, what was happening is people consumed in an infinite, insatiable manner. But that's a discourse that has to be won. I realise that I am in a university, but I would pose a question to every university as to how, for example, it has been teaching economics. My friend, Professor Howard Stein from the University of Michigan, drew my attention to a study of North American universities, where those studying economics study for less than 10% on the history of the subject in 4 years teaching. And at the same time, an interesting one was this. There was another paper recently about young economics students who were interviewed in their first week of taking on economics courses and interviewed at the end of the year. And they had considerably decreased in their commitment to giving aid to other things. In other words, it was a kind of indoctrination within a single fallacious paradigm that is not, as I said in my paper, submitting its assumptions to theoretical review. The assumption, for example, I do believe as well, in relation to theoretical work in economics, that you shouldn't have to wait to get the Nobel Prize before your conscience starts.
Time for more questions. One right here. Microphone needs to come down, and is one acknowledged after that.
Thank you. My name is Brechtje Wijzenbeek. I'm from the Embassy of the Netherlands here in Pretoria. I would like to ask the Honourable President what opportunities he sees in terms of human rights dialogue between European member states and South Africa. And I would also like to pose all the brilliant legal minds in the room if they have any view on this collaboration or dialogue on human rights with European member states, especially those, like the Netherlands, who are with South Africa in the UN Council for Human Rights. Thank you.
Sorry, right here. We'll come to the slide.
Hello, Mr. President. My name is Anas Ahmed. I'm a second-year Bachelor of Accounting Science student from the School of Accountancy. I have some relatives in Ireland and England, and I've quite noticed that the human rights there is very good. The standards are quite good. And compared to South Africa, it is way better. So the question is, how does Ireland manage to give an excellent standard of human rights to each individual? Is it the governance? Is it the population? Or is it the poverty in South Africa that is a problem compared to Ireland? How can you advise us to have a good standard of human rights delivered to each and every citizen in the country?
That's a very good question. I think that if I might, this phrase which occurs in so many of the basic text, the progressive realization of, and so on, has always caused me some difficulty. But let me just say about the South African Constitution and the Bill of Rights. More than one person has said to me that maybe it was too ambitious a document and so forth. I profoundly disagree. I referred in my paper to the document being an invitation to transformation. And I think that was in the correct road to go, in my view. It's my personal view. And therefore, inevitably, if you were in the political process, most of your life, as I was, from the moment you publish such a document, and from the moment you get people to commit to it, people will inevitably release a great impatience. Why isn't it happening? And so forth. Now, many Western governments, particularly when you're talking about economic, social, and cultural rights, will have many elaborations on this phrase, the progressive realization of, or in the Irish case, in some of our rights, as resources allow. But on the first question about relation to the human rights discourse and the possibilities exchanged between members of the European Union, for example, I think there are many ways in which this can happen. But I think the more important thing is for, if you like, the conscientization of the population in general, that human rights does not belong solely to lawyers, that human rights is something that is in fact part of citizenship, therefore carrying with it commitments in terms of responsibilities, but guaranteed rights. There is a huge difference, of course, between the different countries. There's a difference between just think of the European Union, you might ask another question which would be more provocative. To what extent has the mind of empire departed? I'm in South America. I remember meeting some people in Buenaventura, where people had been moved first from a river, then from the seafront and so forth. And the point one had about it is that how are rights to be delivered? But I think that's the important, why I stressed in the paper the importance of social movements, about articulating the case for human rights, but also spreading the demand, the understanding of human rights more broadly among the people. There are difficulties in the different states in Europe as well, in which the human rights mechanisms are seen to be in contention with departments of justice. In other words, that the state will in fact have a justice ministry and so forth, so that the last thing it wants are stroppy people testing what are in fact matters that may have been decided by Parliament. And I think that's something that will continue. The other part about the Human Rights Council itself is a very serious issue, insofar as there is an immense diplomatic competition to get on the Human Rights Council. But you might well ask the question, why do you want to be on the Council? Are you there, or do different countries want to be there to block something or to achieve something? Very often the purpose of seeking election and taking a place is in fact actually to set up a screen against some of your own practices. I'm very much in favour of an even deeper review mechanism which will test human rights. But then it would take me a whole day to another argument that one of the things that did arrive since in the last couple of weeks when I've been here in Africa is the people fire up a defensive screen in the name of tradition or in the name of culture, and that is supposed, behind which you can shelter and justify the non-delivery of human rights. I think particularly in relation to, for example, some rights affecting women's rights, affecting children, affecting reproduction and so forth, I think it is outrageous. There was never any I argued in my paper to try and see the realization of human rights through the prism of culture. I think that's a very different proposal than to saying that you can in fact have a kind of cultural relativism that cuts across the project of universal human rights. There is a problem too then, I think, that we must face up to. I think it is only in the last couple of years that the actual texts of Eleanor Roosevelt's procedures in establishing, for example, the Declaration have now been available. And one can see that a very small number of people who contributed to that document. Again, you might ask, there's another question for academics to look, why, for example, did it not draw on anthropology in relation to be informed in relation to the text? But these are all very good issues for the future.
I'm going to take 2 more questions, and they're going to come from this side. Recognize you, sir, and one behind you. First in the front.
A very good morning. A very good morning to you, Mr. President, and the very esteemed members in the House. It's Kaya Kumalo here. I'm a journalist with Kaya FM right in Johannesburg. I just want to get your input too, Mr. President. Here in Africa, we've seen a wave of anti-homosexual bills in countries like Uganda and so forth. What's your view on that, and how do we try and reverse such moves, in this day and age? Thank you.
Second question.
Thank you. My name is Cathal Gilbert. I'm a consultant working with Civicus and the Foundation for Human Rights, and I come from West Cork. My question, Mr. President, and thank you very much for a very enlightening address. I think you rightly gave us a very broad definition of social movements and civil society. But if I could ask you to focus on what you identified as the placard carrying part of it.
Yes.
We live in a world where protest is very topical. You'll know in Ireland that we had 120,000 people on the streets recently protesting against water charges. This country is no stranger to protest. And I think that as a foundational part of the human rights infrastructure, freedom of assembly, freedom of peaceful assembly is very important. I'd be very interested to get your view on how you see the global response from states to citizens attempting to exercise that freedom, your own view from Ireland and what you've picked up from speaking to other global leaders. Thank you.
Yes. It's very interesting. First of all, the first question, I think that there are 38 states in Africa that in fact have legalized against homosexuality practices with consenting adults. 38. And they vary in terms of whether the law is left there and ignored, whether the law is sought to be implemented, and sometimes whether in fact people are sentenced on the basis of the law. And of course, when I said that in relation to the integrity of the person, and so on, these pieces of law and the atmosphere that makes them possible to continue are violations of human rights in the most fundamental sense, as far as I'm concerned, and I've spoken about that. Then I've talked to some heads of state about this, in a way, and very often people, this is one of the tensions that are there. They will tell you that they have a personal view, but that they don't believe that the people support change. I think you will never get anywhere with that kind of thinking. I think what you have to do is that you have to recognize the right, and you have to go out in the heat of the day and defend the right. And I very much are in sympathy with those people who have to suffer greatly to seek vindication of their rights in this area and other areas. And that's how it is. The interesting side of it, to me, about when I look back at the decades in which I was involved in teaching political science as well, about how Europe was terrified of Marxist scholarship, for example, but it completely ignored what Max Weber was saying, that an iron cage would emerge in which people would in fact be so circumscribed that they couldn't remember any longer how it was that a particular prohibition or law came into existence. The other side of it as well, I think that it is also based on a great and dangerous ignorance, because if one looked at the human relations files in anyone wanted to look at the anthropological sources and so forth, I think that one has to stay protesting. And brings me to the next the question in relation to the people with placards. It's the state is interesting. Is that when does a demonstration, in fact, direct itself at the fundamentals of a social system? Let me just say a word about the state, because it's important that I say so, because I used to teach in the area of the state some years ago. After World War II, nearly every country in Europe, of which I can speak, spoke about the state intervention in people's lives as being necessary. For example, the great monument to democracy was the British National Health Service, from which people from Ireland as well as Britain benefited. So that was the state. Equally in relation to other forms of law, it was the state acting, if you like, in the general interest. In the last 25 years, we've seen an opposition, particularly from the Reagan-Thatcher period, an opposition to the very idea of the state, that the state must be minimized, the state must get out of the way. Greenspan had that view in relation to the amendments to the Glass-Steagall Act, in relation to as he said to President Clinton, the market is screaming for product. So trash bonds were circulated around the world, then through pension funds, then into central banks, who could no longer object because they were trading in these particular trash products. So this idea of the state should you therefore, how are you going to change things if you want to do that? if you take a philosopher like Alistair McIntyre says more or less, we almost have to start all over again with communalism and so on. Well, I have a different view, and that is that working people and people who are excluded have struggled too long, over too long a period, to abandon the realm of the state. Now, that having been said, the next question that arises then is that if you accept the idea that the state can be positive or the state can be negative in the general area, is how do you influence the state? Well, what happens in relation to some of the campaigns in Ireland, which I could tell you about, is that the advocacy sometimes stops at the point of legislation. In other words, when you have won the piece of legislation, you can go home. But in fact, in every one of the cases, the administrative system can entirely negative what has been achieved in relation to law. You can thus, for example, in relation to the individual apparatus of the state, which might be quite conservative, can put administrative blocks on the delivery, be it in relation to poverty, be it in relation to housing, be it in relation to health or whatever. So what you have to do, I spoke when I was speaking in Soweto about this, I said that you need a new kind of activism that is radical, that is research-based, that is informed, and that is simply clever in being able to understand the logic of the state. So that, in a curious way, the point is, you might ask yourself, as Demirs, which is the more important, occupying the forecourt of a bank or occupying the state? I think that if we are to make progress, you have to bring the people with you, and that's the difficulty in many cases. In the question in relation to gay rights, for example, it's amazing how people can come to hold very, very determined views. Much of it, in the case of the Irish case, for example, after our independence, just about 100 years ago, we produced an extremely conservative state. A state that was conservative in relation to censorship, conservative in relation to health, conservative in relation to the poor, conservative in many things. So one of the things that was interesting is, I quoted a poet to finish my paper and all the rest of it. The poets are missing after the establishment of the Irish state because people occupy the interstices of the state in a very conservative way. So what would you do then? Well, there's nothing wrong, I think, myself, with communalism, as Alistair McIntyre writes about it. But I don't believe that those of us who have worked so long to be at the centre of the legislative process itself should walk away from the state. And these are very interesting issues. The other one about it as well, in relation to draw a distinction between what is a democratic agitation and what is simply a populist expression. For example, you will get people to join in populist expressions even against the whole question of equal rights of people in relation to sexuality or anything like that. But the test of leadership is in fact actually to be able to go out and defend your cause and to make your case to the people. Now, I think that we are in a rather dreadful situation at the present time in so many of the countries in Europe because we're dealing with the legacy of individualism. And it was in many cases said, if you go around the world and you look at even places who have achieved freedom, is freedom the freedom to live in a gated community? Keeping the others out because you assume that they want what you have and you're not giving it up, and so forth. All of this, these issues are terribly, terribly important. And you will arrive at a conclusion as well, is that democracy, I stressed education, democracy is not something that is confined to voting every 4 or 5 years. It is about the way you deal with how people, men and women deal with each other, how people of different ages deal with each other, of having a conception that is long, that speaks about intergenerational justice and its relationship, for example, to the ecological issues, and so on. So I think that there is a need for activism that, as I repeat, is radical, well-informed, research-based, and then this is the lesson, I believe, of President Mandela, that is dialogical. It is to when you are certain of, not certain, but when you are assured of that you have done what I've just said in relation to having an informed opinion, to be able to place it alongside another person's opinion, to be able to look in the face of the other person and say we are not here to trade certainties. We are in fact actually to see how we can in fact make an advance that will give meaning to law, meaning to democracy, meaning to deliberative democracy, and so on. And these are real challenges, and it's all there to be. The good last point I'll make about it is that in some ways over the last 50 years, politics and the public world have become a kind of extension of the economic system. The main economic paradigm of infinite growth, insatiable wants, is now cracking wide open. There are areas where one after the other in different expressions in different countries. But the case for a new paradigm, the case, for example, this was in the mind of John Maynard Keynes, it was in the mind of Marshall, it was in the mind of Adam Smith. Remember, who wrote the theory of moral sentiments 7 years before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. It was the location of the economic within an ethical frame, within a philosophical system that is open to criticism and that is debated generation after generation with pluralist scholarship. And that is where I stand really on it. I think it is these conversations that we must have if we are to go forward.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Michael D. Higgins, President of Ireland, not failed in that advertisement given before that. And you can see also that there's probably a vacancy for him as a lecturer after the term of office of presidency is over, should he wish to take it up. So thank you very much for your time, being very generous to answer in detail very many of our questions. I call upon our acting Vice Chancellor to say the word.
His Excellency, thank you very much for what I consider to be a very spirited message. A spirited message not only to our School of Law, to our university, to our country, but I think also to other parts of both the African continent and the rest of the world. I think you were gracious in accepting the opportunity to answer questions. And again, I think there are many of us that can learn from that, that after your keynote address, you should in fact open up the floor to get also a response to what you have said. I certainly personally value the fact that you have highlighted that we have to juxtapose human rights and economic development. And it's not the one or the other, but that we should interrogate the nexus of those two. You have also reminded us that within our South African context, that we have made some contributions to the world in which, in the way human rights are perceived and practiced, and also in terms of how our law gives expression to that. But I would like to say in thanking you for all these messages, that we as a South African community, and for that matter the continent of Africa, have many, many challenges. And sometimes our decisions, whether to in fact go either one side where it comes to human rights or the economic development, there's sometimes a short-term view that's taken in the decisions going forward. And many times this has long-term effects on the developments of both the people and the countries. So I thank you once again for certainly the messages you've given us, for the encouragement you have given us as a community, and I would urge you to in fact think about the generous invitation by Professor because I think our students here do need your spirit, your passion, and I can see you have a lot of passion, and certainly the experience which you have built up through your many years of fighting for injustice and human rights. So thank you once again to you, Mrs. Higgins, the rest of your delegation for being here today. I would also like to thank the School of Law for arranging this function and this opportunity, and again to show certainly that not only can you make use of your networks and friends, Professor Jeshan, but that there is a contribution still. And the School of Law has made many, many contributions to South African society, but there is still a contribution that the school can in fact make. To people that have organized this event, others who have been mentioned, I would also like to say thank you, and I would also like to thank you as an audience for not demonstrating, although there wasn't any reason to demonstrate, but certainly for your thoughtful questions, and certainly without, well, the questions were frank, I think, and they were also frankly answered. With that then, I thank you all for being here and sharing this opportunity with us. I would like to invite you all now to join us for drinks and snacks in the foyer on my left. Thank you very much.